Dear brothers and sisters, today's video is different from the usual. This is a video where we will analyze the details and hidden meanings that most people have overlooked in the photo of the Pope released by the Vatican. I invite you to take a few minutes and watch the video until the end because what I am about to show you is important for all of us. In the photo, Pope Francis is seated with his back turned in a wheelchair in the chapel of the Gemelli Hospital, wearing liturgical vestments and looking towards the altar. This is not just a simple, candid snapshot. It is a moment of spiritual life captured and shared with the entire world. When the image of Pope Francis in the hospital appeared on our screens after over a month of hospitalization, time seemed to stand still for an instant. In that fleeting moment, we recognized something profound: the fragility of an elderly man in prayer, a pontiff who, despite being tested by illness, continues to bear witness through his silence and presence. That moment dissolved anxieties and speculations, abruptly silencing the alarmist and conspiratorial voices that had accumulated over weeks of absence. But beyond the immediate sigh of relief, we found ourselves scrutinizing every detail of that photo, seeking to grasp its hidden message, more than what meets the eye. The first striking aspect of the photo is Pope Francis's collected and humble posture. He is portrayed from behind and slightly in profile, with his head bowed and his eyes half closed, immersed in prayer. His body conveys a sense of recollection. The pontiff sits quietly, most likely in his wheelchair, before the altar, like any other faithful meditating in a chapel after Mass. There are no dramatic gestures or glances toward the camera. On the contrary, the Pope shows us his back, almost as if to tell us that what matters in that moment is not his face, but the act of entrusting himself to God. This posture sends a powerful message of humility. Pope Francis appears as a sick man among the sick, a frail, elderly man in prayer, an ordinary patient without any sign of power. His body language speaks directly to the heart. His slightly curved shoulders and bowed head indicate a trusting surrender into the hands of the Lord. Those observing that fragile figure do not see the sovereign of Vatican City or a head of state, but a spiritual father who, like every suffering person, draws strength from faith to move forward. It is as if the Pope were telling all of us, "Yes, I am weak, but my strength comes from another. Do not look at me. Look at the one in whom I, too, place my trust." Even the physical details contribute to this narrative of fragility. For instance, we can see the Pope's right hand resting on his knee, visibly swollen, probably due to IVs and therapies he is undergoing. It is a tender yet painful detail. Those swollen fingers bear witness to his suffering, making him even closer to those who suffer daily. There is no vain pride, no fear of appearing weak. Suffering is displayed with dignity, transformed into silent prayer. Around Pope Francis in the small hospital chapel, every visible object in the photo seems to transform into a symbol filled with spiritual meaning. The scene, though simple, is rich in references to Christian faith. In front of the pontiff, we see the altar covered with a white cloth, upon which stand 2 lit candles, a small central crucifix, and a closed missal resting on a lectern. To the right of the altar, we notice a portable tabernacle, accompanied by the characteristic red lamp, a sign of the Eucharistic presence in the Blessed Sacrament. Furthermore, on the left, in place of a painting that previously depicted the Black Madonna of Czestochowa, so dear to John Paul II, there is now an image of the merciful Jesus, the Christ of St. Faustina's message, with his heart radiating light, symbolizing the infinite divine mercy in which we are called to trust, especially in times of trial. Finally, on the back wall above the altar, a large wooden crucifix stands out. The body of Christ is sculpted in a particular pose, with open arms reaching forward as if descending from the cross. It is as though the crucified Christ himself were extending his arms toward his suffering vicar, in a gesture that seems to embrace the elderly pope tested by illness. The closed missal suggests that the Eucharistic sacrifice has just been completed. Pope Francis has likely celebrated or participated as a concelebrant in the Sunday Mass shortly before, offering his sufferings along with those of Christ on the altar. There is also a small detail, seemingly insignificant, that the photo reveals to the keen observer. Above the altar, next to the sacred furnishings, a half-filled glass of water with a straw is visible. What does a glass with a straw have to do with such a deeply spiritual context? And yet, that very glass is a concrete sign of Pope Francis's condition. It indicates that the Holy Father has difficulty swallowing due to his illness and probably used the straw to receive communion during Mass. It is a deeply touching detail. Even the successor of Peter needs a small aid to drink from the chalice of suffering and consolation. This immediately brings to mind Jesus on the cross when he said, "I thirst," and was offered a sponge soaked in vinegar. Likewise, the Pope, united with the suffering Christ, humbly accepts that sip of water through a straw, reminding us that every act of mercy, giving drink to the thirsty, holds sacred value. Another element to observe closely is how Pope Francis is dressed in this photo. Despite being in the hospital, he is wearing liturgical vestments, a sign that he chose to celebrate, or can celebrate, the Holy Mass. In particular, we notice the purple stole draped over his shoulders above the white garment. Purple is the liturgical color of Lent, a time of penance and conversion, as well as the color used in rites for the sick and the deceased. It evokes contrition of the heart, the recognition of one's fragility and need for God's mercy. Seeing it on the shoulders of the ailing Pope amplifies the message. Francis is experiencing a personal Lent of suffering, uniting it with that of the entire Church in preparation for Easter. The white garment he wears under the stole could be his usual papal cassock or a liturgical alb. However, many observers have noticed that, in reality, the Holy Father is wrapped in a pair of white hospital sheets, arranged to resemble a priestly alb. A keen commentator from the Curia even described Pope Francis's appearance in this photo as shroud-like, precisely because of these sheets that envelop him like a burial shroud, alluding to the white linen that wrapped Christ in his tomb. Over these sheet-like vestments, as mentioned, lies the purple stole, worn, interestingly, in reverse, with the stitching visible at the top instead of at the bottom. This detail suggests an element of improvisation in his hurried vesting. Whoever helped him was likely not a trained master of ceremonies. However, far from diminishing the image, this detail makes it more authentic and human. There is no pursuit of elegance or formal perfection, only the raw and simple reality of a man of faith who, despite his weakness, wishes to celebrate the mysteries of God. It is also striking that Pope Francis is not wearing his usual white zucchetto, which he typically dons in public. His bare head signifies the informal and suffering state he is in. In this intimate moment with God, there is no need for head coverings or insignia of authority. Similarly, his bare hands, one of which, as mentioned, is visibly swollen, appear to be without the fisherman's ring, the pontifical symbol that John Paul II, by contrast, continued to wear even in the hospital. Francis has, in a sense, set aside every symbol of earthly power. All that remains is the bare minimum of his priestly identity, a stole on his shoulders, sign of his indelible priestly ministry, and a white garment, symbolizing both the baptism that made him a Christian and the liturgical vestment with which he celebrates. In this simplicity of attire lies true greatness. The Pope presents himself first and foremost as a minister of God and a son of the Church, a baptized man in prayer, a priest who continues to offer the sacrifice and impart blessings despite his illness. The image of Pope Francis, ill at the Gemelli Hospital, immediately brings to mind another pontiff who endured the same hospital via crucis, St. John Paul II. Some commentators have drawn a comparison, at times a harsh one, between Francis's photo and the last public images of Wojtyła in 2005. It is an intriguing comparison, as it highlights two different ways of living and communicating suffering, while also revealing a profound continuity in Christian witness. It was Lent 20 years ago. John Paul II, gravely afflicted with Parkinson's disease and recovering from a tracheotomy, spent his final weeks of life at the Gemelli Polyclinic in Rome. At that time as well, the Holy See released images of the Pope in the hospital. One in particular remains etched in memory, that of March 6, 2005, the fourth Sunday of Lent, when Wojtyła participated in Mass in the Gemelli Chapel. On that occasion, we see John Paul II seated in a wheelchair disguised as a papal chair, dressed in a rose-colored chasuble, the proper vestment for Latter Sunday in Lent, over a white liturgical alb. Despite his frailty, the Polish Pope wore all the symbols of his office. He had the white zucchetto on his head and the episcopal ring on his finger, symbols of papal authority that he firmly maintained even during his hospitalization. During that celebration, he was not alone. Concelebrating the Mass with him were his personal secretary, Archbishop Stanisław Dziwisz, now a cardinal, and his second secretary, Monsignor Mokrzycki. Additionally, John Paul II was surrounded by his Polish sisters, such as the faithful Sister Tobiana, his personal physician Dr. Buzanetti, and the various doctors and nurses who assisted him. That scene, despite the pain, conveyed an impression of solemnity. The Pope appeared seated in an armchair, fully vested, with his praying entourage around him, as if to say that the governance of the Church was continuing visibly, that Peter, though suffering, was still confirming his brothers in the faith without retreating an inch. It was no coincidence that John Paul II jokingly referred to the Gemelli Hospital as Vatican III, signifying that the hospital had become a sort of third operational headquarters of the papacy after Castel Gandolfo. Pope Francis, in the 2025 photo, appears in a starkly different manner. The most striking difference is that he is alone in the chapel. No assistants, no visitors around him, only the silent presence of Christ in the tabernacle. This image of solitude, described by some as typically Jesuit, referencing Ignatian spirituality's emphasis on personal intimacy with God, contrasts with Francis's usual style. Throughout his pontificate, he has always sought to be among the people, choosing to live in Casa Santa Marta and constantly seeking contact with crowds and the marginalized. Seeing him like this, portrayed without anyone by his side, is almost disorienting. This is a turning point in the pontificate that no one expected, perhaps not even the most media-savvy pope in church history, remarked one observer bitterly. Indeed, Pope Bergoglio has accustomed us to crowds, to massive gatherings, to the image of a shepherd with the smell of the sheep immersed in his flock. Here, however, we see him like Jesus in Gethsemane, in the moment when even the disciples sleep, alone with the Father in the hour of trial. This solitude might seem sorrowful, and certainly it is striking to see the Pope without his collaborators around him, but it also carries a prophetic force. It communicates the essential nature of that personal encounter with God, from which every ministry draws its strength. Francis seems to have chosen to be portrayed alone to emphasize that in that moment ceremonies and protocols do not matter, only he, the sick priest, before his Lord. Yet, despite their differences, there is a profound continuity between John Paul II and Francis. Both popes, in their own way, have offered their suffering as a testimony of faith for the Church. John Paul II, in the final years of his life, courageously chose not to hide his infirmities. He appeared in public trembling, with a voice barely audible, until his final silent blessing from the window of the Apostolic Palace on Easter 2005. The whole world saw him embrace the cross until the very end, teaching by example that life has value even in extreme weakness, and that suffering, united with Christ, becomes light. He was famously described as a sick man among the sick, a title given to him during his last pilgrimage to Lourdes in 2004. Similarly, Francis today presents himself as a sick man among the sick. In his Angelus, he openly spoke of feeling fragile and uniting himself with all the sick, and in this photo we see him precisely as that, fragile among the fragile. Both popes, therefore, teach us not to fear weakness. John Paul II kept a firm hand on the helm of the Church even when his body was collapsing, while Francis presents himself as prayerful and serene even when his strength fails him. In two different ways, they give us the same evangelical lesson. When I am weak, then I am strong, for God's power is fully manifested in weakness offered with love. We can also interpret this relay between the two popes as a sign of the times. John Paul II showed the world the redemptive value of suffering lived publicly. The elderly and sick pope became a beacon against the throwaway culture, demonstrating that elderly and suffering lives are precious before God and must never be discarded or hidden. Pope Francis, on the other hand, in an era of even more instantaneous and ruthless communication, social media, fake news, media voyeurism, chooses to reveal a single contemplative image after a long silence, almost as if to remove suffering from spectacle and restore it to mystery. Where Wojtyła was under the spotlight during his final Via Crucis at the Colosseum, supported by Cardinal Ratzinger, Bergoglio remained hidden for weeks and then reappeared only in silent prayer. These are different choices, but both guided by the Spirit for the good of the Church in different historical moments. And in both, there is an immense love for God, to whom they offer themselves, and love for the people, to whom they wish to impart a final teaching. John Paul II cried out through the silence of his suffering, "Do not be afraid to share in the passion of Christ." Francis today seems to whisper through his image, "Stay centered on Christ even when your shepherd is weak. Faith is not built on man, but on God." In both cases, Christ remains at the center. He is the true rock on which the Church stands, even when the vicar of Christ is ill or aged. Perhaps this is the greatest testimony that both of these saintly popes offer us. The Pope carries the cross like Christ, and in doing so strengthens our faith that the cross, when embraced with love, leads to resurrection. In conclusion, this deeply moving photo of the Pope in the hospital conveys a clear message. In weakness, the power of God shines forth. Pope Francis, seated in that small chapel, clothed only in the strength of the sacraments, reveals the Church in its deepest truth. A Church that triumphs not through power but through faith. A Church whose strength lies in weakness, in fragility, and in complete trust in God. Let us take this lesson to heart. Let us allow ourselves to be embraced by the crucified one, just as Francis was spiritually embraced in that photo. And let us respond to the Lord's love with concrete actions, fervent prayer, unity with the Pope and with those who suffer, humble service to the sick, and joyful testimony that Christ is alive and working, even from a hospital bed. By doing so, we will carry forward the implicit invitation of that image, and we too, in our daily lives, will become beacons of hope. Let us know in the comments what you think of this reflection and what you felt when you saw this photo. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you won't miss new videos and to become part of this community of faith. May God bless us all.